Hey guys. Tonight we begin with the absolutely miserable, awkward, and often misunderstood life of the medieval torturer. The one person in history who had job security, a government salary, and absolutely no dinner party invitations. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You weren't born swinging chains and adjusting thumb screws. Like most medieval children, you came into the world in a cramped cottage that smelled like wet straw and old onions. You were small, quiet, a little too fascinated with frogs. Nobody thought much of it until you started asking strange questions. While other kids played with wooden swords and imagined being knights, you were the one picking apart dead mice behind the bakery and asking your parents how joints worked. Not in a "this child is gifted" way. More in a "this child makes the priest uncomfortable" way. By the time you were 10, you already knew how to sharpen a knife, not for hunting, just because it made you feel organized. You weren't violent, you were curious. Which, in a medieval village, was a dangerous thing to be. You didn't come from wealth. Your father was probably a butcher or a cooper, someone used to dealing with messy things. Your mother might have sold herbs or whispered things about healing wounds in ways that made the neighbors uneasy. You weren't cursed. You were just available. Then came the day someone suggested an opportunity. A magistrate or maybe the town steward looked at you, small, quiet, observant, and said, "He's not squeamish, is he?" That was the medieval version of a job offer. Soon after, you found yourself apprenticed. Not to a knight or a blacksmith, but to a man with an apron that smelled like vinegar and iron. He didn't smile much. He didn't explain much either. Just pointed at things and expected you to understand. A bench here, a chain there, a bucket with no explanation. You swept floors. You cleaned tools. You were told not to ask what they were for. You started having questions. Then you started learning not to ask them. At night, you slept lightly, not out of fear, but because your room was next to the hallway that led below. The stairs creaked, the doors echoed, and sometimes you thought you heard whispers that weren't yours. And that's how it began. Not with a moment of evil, just with a quiet child, a practical town, and a job nobody else wanted. You never officially chose the path. It just sort of happened to you. One day you were helping your mother grind herbs or sweeping behind the tavern. The next, you were standing at the edge of town with a small sack of bread, a worn cloak, and instructions to go live with Uncle Gregor. Uncle Gregor wasn't your actual uncle. No one really knew if he had family. He lived just beyond the edge of the village, not far enough to be suspicious, but far enough that nobody had to walk past his door on the way to church. He had a house with no garden, a locked shed, and a surprisingly large collection of ropes. You didn't ask questions. That was rule number 1. Gregor didn't talk much. He wasn't cruel, just practical. You'd arrive in the morning and he'd be sharpening something that didn't look like it belonged in a kitchen. He taught you how to boil water, mix cleaning solutions, and oil gears. If you asked what they were for, he'd just grunt. If you guessed correctly, he'd grunt louder. Your first week was spent scrubbing stains off benches, organizing chains by size, and learning how to fix a wooden crank without losing your fingers. It was all very mechanical. No explanations, no emotional commentary, just tasks. In the evenings, Gregor would sit near the fire with a tin cup, staring at the flames. You sat across from him, trying not to breathe too loudly. Occasionally, he'd hand you a book. Not the Bible, something older, something with pages that smelled like ash, and pages about restraint technique and skeletal tolerances. You didn't understand all of it, but you understood it was important. Once, you tried to talk to a boy your age near the river. He asked what you were learning. You said, truthfully, how to keep things from breaking too early. He didn't talk to you again after that. By the end of the first month, you knew how to tie 4 different types of knots, how to identify bone by shape, and how to clean a heavy metal mask without letting the rust set in. You weren't being taught a trade, you were being taught silence. Your first real day on the job didn't begin with a ceremony. No scroll, no handshake, no welcome to the Ministry of Pain. It started with a key, a heavy iron one, dropped into your palm with a grunt from Gregor. "Basement, you know the way," he said, as if you'd been dying to visit. Down the creaking stone steps you went, holding a torch in one hand and your sense of direction in the other. The air got colder with every step. Not refreshing cold, more like forgotten cellar cold. The kind that settles into your bones and starts making suggestions. The room at the bottom wasn't large, but it made up for it in mood. Low ceilings, walls that had never seen the sun, a wooden table in the middle, worn smooth by centuries of unpleasant conversations. Ropes hung on pegs like a particularly unsettling coat rack. In the corner, a bucket. Always a bucket. Gregor didn't explain anything. He just pointed. "Clean that, oil this, and never leave the wheel loose. Last time it slipped, we almost had to get creative." You nodded. You were 15, maybe 16, and already too deep in to pretend you didn't understand. You scrubbed without asking what you were scrubbing. You wiped handles and hinges that clearly hadn't been touched since someone last, let's say, expressed themselves. That afternoon, someone was brought in. Not for you, not yet, but you were told to stay, to observe, to learn pacing. Apparently, even agony had a rhythm. The man in the chair said nothing for a long time. Then he said too much. You weren't asked to help, just to keep things tidy. Replace a cloth here, refill a jug there. You did as told, trying not to focus on anything too specific. When it was done, Gregor handed you a cloth and gestured at the floor. "No one else cleans," he said. That was your welcome. Later, you sat by the fire, your hands still damp and smelling like old iron. Gregor sipped from his cup. You didn't speak, not because you were afraid, but because you already understood something. The job didn't want questions. It just wanted quiet, obedient hands. And yours, apparently, were perfect. After a few weeks of successful silence, Gregor gave you something resembling a promotion. Your first set of work clothes. It wasn't a robe. It wasn't ceremonial. It was a leather apron stiff from use and a pair of gloves that had definitely seen things. He handed them over without comment, as if this was a completely normal milestone. No fanfare, no warnings. Just, "You'll need these. The splinters are worse than the noise." You held them like they might bite. The apron was thick, cracked in places, and smelled like boiled vinegar with a hint of regret. The gloves were heavier than you expected, reinforced at the fingers, likely to help with gripping things you didn't want to touch but had to anyway. You put them on. They fit. Unfortunately, there was no mask, no hood, no dramatic silhouette like in the plays. Torturers didn't get mystery. You had a face, and everyone eventually remembered it. Out in the village, it didn't matter if you wore the gear or not. People could tell. It was something in the posture. Alert, slightly hunched, always ready to dodge flying accusations or a surprise confession. You could be wearing your Sunday best, and people would still cross the road to avoid eye contact. The gloves became your signature. You started wearing them out of habit, even when sweeping, even when eating. It wasn't vanity. It was convenience. You never knew when you'd be asked to help tighten something, or someone. And then there were the boots, heavy-soled, clunky, and designed for traction on slippery stone floors, which is all we'll say about that. Walking in them made a sound, a dull, final sort of thud. People learned to recognize it. Mothers would grab their children. Shopkeepers would suddenly become very busy behind the counter. You once tried smiling at a girl near the well. She looked at your gloves, your boots, your general aura of, I oil sharp things in my spare time, and promptly dropped her bucket. The uniform wasn't just leather and laces. It was a warning label. It told the world, this man is useful, but not touchable. And that's exactly how they treated you. Once you'd proven yourself competent, meaning you could tie a knot, follow directions, and not faint at awkward moments, the town offered you your own quarters. Calling it a house was generous. It was more of a stone rectangle attached to the back of the municipal building that happened to be very close to the dungeon. Close enough that you could hear things. Things like chains moving at night when no one should be moving chains. The space came with exactly 2 perks: a door that locked, and walls thick enough that most sounds didn't echo back into your dreams. Most. There were also smells, constant, subtle, and deeply confusing. The place smelled like someone had once tried to clean it and then given up halfway through. There was a mix of damp wood, overboiled herbs, and something vaguely metallic you didn't ask too many questions about. Your first week living there, a local priest dropped off a small bag of incense with a note that simply read, "Use this, please." Thoughtful, if a little foreboding. The location had its advantages. You were always close to work. Tragically close, in fact. If a magistrate needed a last-minute consultation, you were 15 steps away. No excuses, no holidays, just proximity-based obligation. Neighbours? None. The nearest occupied building was across the square, and even they refused to open their shutters if they heard your boots. You were your own neighbourhood. Population. You and a family of indifferent crows. You tried to make it homey. Maybe a wooden chair, a blanket, a sad attempt at a potted plant that withered under the weight of its surroundings. You once hung a small tapestry. It fell off the wall within a day, as if the house itself rejected colour. Sleep came eventually. Fitful, shallow, dreamless. You got used to the thuds, the muffled voices, the late-night deliveries that no one wanted to talk about. You developed the ability to wake up instantly, but never fully rest. It wasn't haunted. Not exactly. It was just saturated with memory. Not yours, but other people's. And it pressed against you in the silence like fog you couldn't brush off. Welcome home. In theory, you were a public servant. Emphasis on public. In practice, the only thing public about you was how publicly everyone avoided you. People didn't speak to you so much as around you, like you were a pothole in a conversation they were trying not to fall into. You'd walk into a tavern and watch entire tables develop sudden, urgent fascinations with their bread crusts. Children were ushered indoors. Dogs barked at you, then reconsidered. You weren't officially banned from events, but somehow you never got the invitation. Weddings? Oh, must have been lost with the courier. Harvest festivals? Ah, we thought you were busy with your iron things. Your presence, it seemed, didn't pair well with joy. At market, merchants greeted you with the sort of strained politeness reserved for tax collectors and distant in-laws. You got service, yes, but fast, clipped, and with an urgent desire for you to be somewhere else. You paid in coin like everyone else, but the bread always seemed a little stale, the fruit a little too firm. Once, in a bold moment, you tried to join a group near the well. They laughed, shared wine, told stories. You smiled, stepped forward. One glance at your gloves, not bloody, just recognizable, and the conversation dissolved like sugar in warm tea. You stood there, holding your jug, and quietly turned around. Friendship wasn't impossible, just highly unlikely. Other tradesmen had guilds, blacksmiths had camaraderie. Even the village drunk had drinking buddies. You had Gregor, who once nodded at you and said, "You're less disappointing than most." High praise. There were no romantic prospects either. If someone looked at you twice, it was probably to make sure they could describe you accurately to the priest later. You didn't get love letters. You got notes slid under your door that said things like, "Please don't take my husband. He's innocent, mostly." And yet, you weren't hated. That would imply passion. You were simply regarded as necessary but unfortunate, like damp weather or tax season. You weren't part of the village, you were adjacent to it, standing just outside the circle, waiting to be summoned. And most days, you preferred it that way. Down a narrow corridor behind the town hall, past a wooden door no one ever knocked on, lay your workspace, affectionately referred to by locals as that place. They never said more. They didn't have to. It wasn't a room. It was a mood. The walls were stone, but not smooth. They had texture, grooves, stains, and little notches that no one dared catalogue. There were no windows. Just a single torch bracket near the entrance and the occasional flicker of light that somehow made things worse. No matter how many candles you lit, the shadows always won. In the centre was the table, heavy oak, reinforced, unnaturally solid. It was the kind of furniture that didn't get built, it arrived. Ropes coiled neatly at each corner, like stage props waiting for a deeply unfunny performance. Nearby stood the chair, not for sitting, just the chair. The walls were lined with tools, each hanging in its designated spot, like a very cursed kitchen. Hooks, clamps, screws, gears, the greatest hits of medieval anxiety. Some looked practical, others looked like they'd been invented on a dare. There were things with cranks, things with weights, and one device that rattled even when untouched, which you simply ignored out of self-preservation. In one corner stood the bucket. No one talked about the bucket. It had no label, no owner, no explanation, just a quiet authority over the room. You cleaned it out of duty, not curiosity. The smell was complicated, a mixture of damp stone, hot iron, and something old that clung to the air like forgotten memories. You tried herbs. You tried incense. Once you even tried hanging lavender. It laughed at you. Gregor insisted on neatness. A messy workspace is an unprofessional one, he'd mutter, while aligning shackles with a ruler. You learned to sweep daily, polish metal, and replace fraying rope before it failed. This wasn't cruelty, it was customer service. You didn't decorate. No wall art. No flowers. Just a shelf for your gloves and a small bench where you sometimes sat, thinking about how silence could hum. And yet, it was yours. No one else entered. No one else touched anything, because no one else wanted to. No one tells you this going in, but the job requires math. Not the fun kind with coins or catapults. No, your specialty was pain math, a grim form of arithmetic involving joints, pressure, angles, and how long a person could remain conscious under moderately medieval conditions. You knew, for example, that the average shoulder could handle 7 full rotations before something gave. You didn't learn that from books. You learned it from experience, which, unfortunately, meant other people's experiences. There were no charts, no official formulas, just mental calculations, quiet observations, and the kind of intuition one normally associates with locksmiths or battlefield surgeons. You had to know how much was just enough, and when a bit more became oops. Gregor had taught you the basics. 3 turns for a warning, 4 for honesty, 5 if they still insist on lying about the goat. He wasn't joking. Medieval justice was obsessed with balance, enough pain to encourage confession, not so much that you had to explain anything to the bishop. Your tools didn't have instructions, but you learned their tolerances, like a musician knows their lute. The wheel turned smoothly if oiled. The vise creaked when over-tightened. The iron collar had a sweet spot between firm and regrettable. Precision was everything. People assumed you were a brute, that you just flailed around until someone screamed the right name. In truth, you were closer to a chef. Timing, pressure, control, all crucial. The difference was that no one clapped when you were done. Over time, you developed a 6th sense. You could look at someone and estimate how many minutes they'd last before reconsidering their entire life. It wasn't pride, just pattern recognition. But the worst part? When you were right too often. When your calculations were flawless, that's when the magistrate started relying on you. He hasn't confessed yet. Maybe give him the usual, they'd say, like ordering stew at a tavern. You weren't a monster, you were a professional, with a surprisingly accurate internal calculator, calibrated in screams per second. Most days you were invisible. People saw you, sure. They crossed the street to avoid you, muttered prayers under their breath when you walked past, and pretended to be fascinated by cracks in the cobblestones whenever you approached. But they didn't talk to you. Not really. Unless, of course, they needed something. Then suddenly, you were essential. A magistrate would appear at your door looking stressed and suspiciously polite. We need a confession. Soon. No mention of justice, no explanation. Just the expectation that you'd produce results, like a very unsettling bread maker. Other times it was a priest, insisting this was all about saving souls. We must encourage repentance. Encouragement, in this case, involved rope, heat, and a room with no windows. Spiritual growth through tension, you might say. Even merchants would sometimes send word, quietly of course, that a rival had been saying certain things. Nothing official, mind you. Just, if you happen to be adjusting your tools today, maybe you pass by his stall? You were never formally asked. That would have implied complicity. Instead, you received vague suggestions. Nods. A small sack of coins left at your door with a note that read, "To ensure order is maintained." Order was always in fashion, but when the job was done, silence. The magistrate went back to pretending he didn't know your name. The priest forgot your soul needed saving. The merchant avoided eye contact while overcharging you for onions. Your usefulness had a shelf life, roughly 2 screams long, and you accepted it. Not out of pride, but practicality. If you waited for gratitude, you'd die of it. Your reward was continued employment, a locked door, and the occasional loaf of bread that wasn't entirely stale. In many ways, you were like a bucket of water in a fire. No one thinks about it, until everything's smoking. Then it's, where's the torturer? And after, just a damp floor, and footsteps fading quickly. The room was stone. Stone floors, stone walls, stone ceiling, all very sturdy, all very echoey. That was the first problem no one warned you about, the acoustics. Medieval architecture wasn't designed with acoustical dampening in mind. In fact, if anything, it was the opposite. It seemed designed to celebrate sound, especially the kinds of sounds that made dinner less appetizing. The screams, when they came, didn't just happen once. They bounced. Off walls, down corridors, into the water basin, out through the stairwell, and, on a particularly humid day, straight into your pillow. And they lingered. You'd finish a session, clean the tools, wash your hands, mutter something philosophical like, "Well, that escalated," and still you'd hear it, faintly, somewhere in the ceiling, like your workplace was trying to keep a memory alive. Gregor called it feedback. You tried everything. You stuffed straw into cracks. You rearranged the furniture. You even asked the blacksmith about muffling panels. He just stared at you like you'd asked for silk curtains in a plague house. Eventually, you adapted, learned to distinguish the real screams from the delayed ones. You could even tell which ones were from that morning versus 3 days ago, a grim sort of soundtracking. The townsfolk claimed not to hear it. But then again, they also claimed you weren't technically part of the community, which is a polite way of saying, "We hear it. We're just pretending it's thunder." At night, it got worse. The dungeon was quiet, too quiet, and then one creak, one echo, and suddenly you were sitting upright, wondering if the chains had learned to speak. You started sleeping with your gloves on, not for protection, just out of instinct. They felt safe, familiar, like you could grab a tool and assert dominance over an empty hallway if necessary. Some torturers went mad from it. That's what they said. You didn't. You just got used to being followed, not by people, but by reverberation. The job didn't haunt you. The leftover acoustics did. And really, isn't that worse? You'd think a job that involved handling confessions, fear, and the occasional dislocated nobleman would come with decent compensation. You'd be wrong. Your pay wasn't just bad. It was inconsistent, confusing, and occasionally involved cheese. Officially, you were employed by the town. Unofficially, you were funded by whatever coins could be scraped together from fines, voluntary donations, and the occasional purse left by someone hoping their nephew might survive his questioning. Some weeks, you were paid in silver. Other weeks, they handed you turnips and said, "This is what justice looks like right now." Once, you received a chicken. It was not a good chicken. It looked like it had already heard rumours about your profession. There was no salary, just a vague promise that your services are valued, which is medieval bureaucrat speak for "don't ask." You kept track in a little notebook, not because you expected back pay, but because it made you feel like a person with a desk job. Gregor once told you, "You'll never be rich doing this, but you'll always be needed," which was either comforting or threatening. You're still not sure. You tried negotiating once. You approached the magistrate and calmly pointed out that sharpening tools wasn't free, ropes fray, and vinegar isn't cheap. He nodded solemnly, agreed with everything, and then handed you a single copper coin and a thank you for your continued silence. You couldn't exactly threaten to quit. It's not like there was a long line of applicants. And even if you left, what would you write on your resume? Excellent with knots, skilled in spatial reasoning, experience in crowd control, one person at a time. So you stayed. You budgeted. You reused tools. You learned to patch gloves. You learned to cook stews from things that shouldn't go into stews. You made it work. The irony, of course, was that your job involved applying pressure. But financially, you lived under it. They feared your tools. But when the coins stopped, you feared the butcher. And he didn't negotiate either. Contrary to popular belief, torture in the Middle Ages wasn't just a free-for-all of creativity and bad decisions. There were rules, not good ones, not clear ones, but definitely rules. For example, you couldn't just wake up and decide to interrogate someone because they looked suspicious or owned too many cats. No, you needed authorization, usually from a magistrate, occasionally from a priest, and once from a man who swore he was sent by the king, though his boots said otherwise. The law stated that torture was a last resort. Unfortunately, in practice, last resort often translated to, "We tried shouting at him for 10 minutes and now we're tired." There were guidelines. You weren't allowed to permanently maim anyone, at least not officially. Anything that left someone unable to walk, breathe, or remember their own name was frowned upon, unless of course they confessed. Then it became unfortunate but effective. You had to keep records. Sort of. Usually this meant scratching notes into a wax tablet with vague entries like subject uncooperative, applied moderate persuasion, which could mean anything from a stern look to 4 turns of the wheel and a dramatic pause. A priest was often required to be present, mostly to ensure the soul remained salvageable while you tested the limits of the skeletal system. He rarely intervened, unless it was time to argue about theology or break for lunch. And yes, there were banned devices. Iron maidens, for example, weren't used, not because they were too cruel, but because they were mostly a myth. You, on the other hand, had to make do with actual tools, none of which had fancy names. Just things like the crank and that thing with the teeth. What this all meant was that you lived in a strange space, where pain was sanctioned, but only just. You were always one bad day away from being called excessive, a term that usually ended in either dismissal or sudden promotion, depending on who was watching. So yes, torture was regulated, just not in a way that ever made anyone feel better. There were no farewell feasts, no golden chalice handed over in appreciation, no parchment thanking you for years of dedicated ligament-related service. You didn't retire from being a torturer. You simply stopped showing up. That is, if you were lucky. The job didn't come with a long-term plan. No one explained what happened when your hands began to shake or your knees started clicking like old hinges. You just became slower, less precise. And when precision is the difference between confession and complication, that's not ideal. Gregor never retired. One day, he handed you his gloves, nodded once like he was passing down the family cow, and left. Just walked out of the dungeon and into the mist like some grim folk tale. No one ever saw him again. You assumed he died peacefully, probably while cleaning something unnecessarily sharp. You, of course, had no plans to live that long. There were stories, always whispered, always vague, of torturers who tried to walk away, moved to another village, changed their name, opened a bakery. But somehow word got around. And when the townspeople found out their croissants were made by a man who once oiled the crank, business tended to drop. One torturer tried to reinvent himself as a travelling herbalist. His potions were surprisingly effective. So effective, in fact, that the locals accused him of sorcery and burned his hut to the ground. Last anyone heard, he was working as a scarecrow, voluntarily. The truth is, your reputation followed you like smoke. It clung to your clothes, your voice, your silhouette. Even if you stopped practicing, people didn't forget. You weren't a blacksmith or a cobbler. You were the man who had a room. So you stayed, quietly. You trained an apprentice. You took fewer assignments. You learned to sit more and crank less. The town, for its part, pretended you were just still around. Eventually you knew someone else would take your place. They always did. And when that day came, maybe you'd walk out like Gregor, into the mist, into obscurity, into the part of town where no one asked your name, just not yet. You still had work to do. Years passed. People came and went. Wars started. Taxes rose. Plagues visited like old friends. But you remained, quietly in the background, like an inconvenient architectural feature no one wanted to acknowledge or renovate. No one ever said it, but they all knew. You were part of the town's structure now. You didn't expect a legacy. Torturers don't get those. They get whispered about, occasionally blamed for local curses, and sometimes mentioned in old tavern stories when the ale's strong and the mood is grim. Children speculated you ate rats. Teenagers dared each other to knock on your door. Adults avoided eye contact, but still, somehow, expected you to appear when things got messy. But among officials, your name was spoken with a strange reverence. Not respect exactly, more like administrative relief. You were reliable, quiet, efficient, the human equivalent of a broom kept behind a locked door. You never married. Who would you introduce yourself to? Hello, I extract state-approved truth for a living. Fancy a walk? Friends were rare. The apprentice came closest, the poor lad who eventually stopped asking questions and started oiling tools the same way you once had. You taught him everything, even the tricks for keeping gloves from cracking in the cold. He never thanked you, which meant he was learning properly. One winter, a visiting bishop asked who handled justice in the town. The magistrate simply pointed in your direction. The bishop nodded once, didn't ask for details, and when people told stories, they never used your name. Just the man in the basement, a role more than a person, a necessary fixture, like a well or a gallows. You once thought about carving your initials into the wooden bench where you sat between sessions, but it felt unnecessary. The room already remembered you, loudly, echoingly. If there was a legacy, it wasn't stone or script. It was silence. The quiet that came after someone confessed. The empty street when you passed by. The heavy door that never needed to be labelled, because everyone knew. And when you were gone, no one would speak of it, which, honestly, felt appropriate. In medieval society, an invitation to a noble banquet was more than a meal. It was a declaration of status, a political maneuver, and sometimes a trap wrapped in silk ribbon. If you received one, it meant you were either respected, useful, or being watched. There were no mass emails or RSVP links. Invitations came by courier, carried in wax-sealed scrolls, perfumed cloth pouches, or sometimes hand-delivered by a steward wearing the colours of the host's house. For lords and ladies, the invitation wasn't just to dine, it was to be seen. Declining could be interpreted as defiance, and showing up underdressed could damage a family's reputation for years. One missed banquet, and suddenly, rumours of illness, poverty, or rebellion might follow you like fleas on a hound. Peasants, of course, were not on the list. Even minor gentry had to jockey for favour. You didn't just get invited, you earned it. A recent land donation, a marriage alliance, or a well-placed bribe could do the trick. And if you were summoned without warning, that usually meant the host had something to prove, or something to test. Once the invitation was accepted, preparations began immediately. Tailors were summoned, hair was trimmed, and servants were sent ahead to secure the best positioning in the hall. Why? Because where you sat wasn't just about comfort. It reflected your rank. Closer to the Lord meant power and trust. Farther away? You were one spilled goblet from irrelevance. But the politics didn't end with seating. Even the way you arrived mattered. Some guests showed up with entire retinues, parading their wealth in the form of silk banners, gold-trimmed wagons, and glistening steeds. Others arrived discreetly, avoiding attention, hoping to eavesdrop more than be noticed. What no one admitted openly was this. Banquets were stages. The host was the director. The guests were the players. And the feast, no matter how stuffed with swan, boar, or wine, was the performance. To receive an invitation was to step into that theatre. Whether you'd leave with applause or be quietly excluded from the next performance, that depended entirely on how well you played your role. No one just walked into a medieval banquet. That would be like attending a royal wedding in muddy boots. Arrivals were orchestrated performances, calculated, choreographed, and sometimes downright absurd. Picture this. The outer courtyard lit with flaming torches, casting shadows on banners flapping in the breeze. The scent of hay, horse sweat, and anticipation hangs in the air. Then, trumpets, loud enough to make a stable boy drop a bucket. Another noble has arrived. The main gate swings open, and in rolls a gilded carriage, or perhaps a prancing steed with a knight in velvet robes instead of armour. Behind him, attendants scurry, clutching chests of gifts, bolts of fine cloth, or even exotic birds meant to impress the host. Every step was a display of wealth, from the embroidery on the cuffs to the jewels dangling from a lady's ears like miniature chandeliers. But not all arrivals were about dazzle. Some guests preferred subtlety. Cloaks with hoods up, a quiet word to the gatekeeper, no trumpets at all. These were often diplomats, spies, or rivals playing the long game, observing rather than being observed. At the doors of the Great Hall, each guest was formally announced, and this was not a quick process. Titles were long. Lord Eustace of Highmere, Keeper of the Western Marches, Defender of the Blackwood Hills, and twice victor of the summer lists. By the time the announcer got halfway through, the goose was already cold. As they entered, guests subtly took stock of the room. Who was already here? Who was conspicuously absent? Who had dared to wear French silk in an English hall? Every smile hid calculations. Every bow was measured. This wasn't just dinner. It was diplomacy with wine and roast lamb. Meanwhile, servants fluttered about like well-trained shadows. They whisked away cloaks, offered spiced wine, and whispered seating instructions. One wrong move, a noble seated too close to the salt or too far from the lord, and drama was guaranteed before the first course. The arrival set the tone. Applause, whispers, envy, or dread. Whether you burst in like a hero or slinked in like a shadow, once those doors closed behind you, the feast and the games had begun. You'd think sitting down to dinner would be the least complicated part of a feast. But in a medieval banquet hall, seating arrangements were as loaded as a trebuchet. At the center of it all was the high table, usually set on a raised platform and facing the rest of the hall like a throne overseeing its kingdom. This was where the host and their most prestigious guests sat. Kings, dukes, foreign dignitaries, and anyone the host either admired or feared offending. Placement here was everything. Sit one chair too far to the left, and suddenly it looked like you were falling out of favor. Too close, and someone else would be muttering under their breath about favoritism. To the sides of the high table sprawled longer benches and trestle tables, ranked not by comfort, but by social hierarchy. Nobles at the front, knights a few seats down, squires behind them, and eventually merchants, clerics, and other hangers-on scattered like breadcrumbs at the far end of the hall. If you ended up sitting near the kitchens, you were either unlucky or in trouble. But the real tension wasn't just about position, it was about visibility. Who could see you, and who could you be seen with? Sitting next to a rising star could elevate your own standing. Sitting beside someone about to be disgraced? Well, you'd better eat fast. Then there was the salt. Yes, the seasoning. The phrase, above the salt, referred to those seated nearer the host, where the expensive imported salt was placed. Those below it? Considered of lesser importance, it was a subtle yet brutal culinary caste system. And let's not forget the drama of last-minute changes. If someone didn't show up, or someone unexpectedly did, servants would have to rearrange entire rows, quietly, diplomatically, and without spilling wine on a bishop's lap. A single misstep could spark a scandal that lasted for weeks. For the guests, sitting down wasn't about relaxing, it was about watching, and being watched. Every turn of the head, every whisper, every forkful taken too early could be read as a statement. The feast hadn't officially begun yet, but make no mistake, this was where the real appetite games began. The moment the host lifted their goblet, the hall transformed. Conversations hushed, musicians paused, and all eyes turned to the head of the table. A toast was raised, usually in honor of God, the king, or the guests, and then, like a drawbridge slamming down, the banquet began. Forget your modern three-course meal. Medieval feasts came in removes, successive waves of dishes, each more extravagant than the last. The first remove might start humbly, trenches of bread, cheeses, and stewed vegetables. But by the second or third, all bets were off. Whole roasted peacocks reassembled with their feathers on, pies that revealed live birds upon slicing, spit-roasted boars with apples in their mouths. It wasn't just food, it was theatre, and it wasn't served on fine porcelain. Guests ate off trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that soaked up grease and were often thrown to the dogs, the poor, or simply discarded after use. Utensils were optional. Fingers did most of the heavy lifting. A personal knife was standard. Forks were rare and suspiciously foreign. Every dish was a message. A swan dish, prestige and wealth. A foreign spice, global trade ties. A sweet custard dyed with saffron. A display of how much gold you could afford to eat. Presentation mattered as much as flavor. A clever cook could win favor with a sculpted sugar castle or a jelly shaped like a lion. And if you could make the table gasp, your place in the kitchen and your master's good graces was secured. But not everyone got to taste everything. Dishes were distributed based on rank. High lords had entire roasts to themselves, while lesser guests had to fight over scraps or rely on the servant's discretion. This was no buffet. It was a hierarchy with gravy. The servers were highly trained, gliding between tables, balancing trays, whispering titles, and avoiding disaster. A dropped goblet could spell demotion, a spilled dish on the bishop's lap, exile to latrine duty. And as the courses rolled on, the noise in the hall swelled. Laughter grew louder, wine flowed faster, and inhibitions started to melt like butter on hot bread. The feast wasn't just filling bellies, it was feeding egos, alliances, and ambitions, and the night had only just begun. Medieval banquets weren't just about stuffing your face with roast venison and saffron custard. They were spectacles. And once a course was cleared, the real performances began. While cooks scrambled in the kitchens to prepare the next remove, lords and ladies turned their attention to the night's entertainment. Jesters were the first act. Don't let the silly hats fool you. These performers were sharp. A good fool could roast a duke and get away with it. A bad one got pelted with bones. Their juggling, acrobatics, and rhymed insults kept the tension from spilling over into actual duels. With one quip, a jesting fool could diffuse a brewing feud, or start one if he aimed poorly. Then came the minstrels. Lutes, harps, and flutes echoed through the hall as troubadours sang of noble deeds, tragic romances, or the suspicious flatulence of the lord's hunting dog. If a noble was feeling particularly vain, they might even commission a song about themselves, hoping it would spread to other courts like a catchy disease. For higher profile events, the entertainment got stranger. Dwarfs in armor battling with wooden swords, dancing bears in chain collars, mystics reading fortunes between courses. Some lords even staged miniature plays, complete with sets, props, and unfortunate peasants pressed into service as extras. And if the host really wanted to show off, he might unleash fire eaters or magicians who claimed to summon spirits, though those tended to make the bishop nervous. The audience didn't just watch, they judged. A performance that delighted the crowd could earn gold coins, applause, and even a personal audience with the host, but bore the room for more than 2 minutes. That was social death. At best, you were ignored. At worst, the crowd turned hostile, flinging bread crusts and muttering that you'd best learn to dig ditches instead. Of course, not all the action was on stage. Whispered conversations buzzed beneath the music. Lovers exchanged glances. Rivals exchanged veiled threats. Deals were struck, promises made, and occasionally someone got slapped behind a curtain. The performances were dazzling, yes, but they were also a distraction. They gave nobles cover to scheme, flirt, or gossip. For every jest at the centre of the room, 10 serious plots were unfolding in its shadows. And with wine still flowing and appetite still sharp, the feast rolled on, louder, looser, and far more dangerous than it looked. By the midpoint of the banquet, restraint had begun its slow, inevitable death. And the killer? Wine? Or mead? Or ale? Or in some absurd cases, all three mixed together with a sprig of rosemary and a prayer. Medieval feasts didn't serve drinks in moderation. They poured them in endless waves, refilled before you could blink, and expected you to toast every third sentence. Toast to the host. Toast to the king. Toast to the weather, the pigs, the jester's new haircut. It didn't matter. The goal was to keep everyone happy, loose, and, ideally, too drunk to complain about the undercooked eel. But this wasn't just about revelry. Alcohol was a political weapon. One drink too many, and a knight might blurt out something regrettable. A merchant might reveal trade secrets. A noblewoman might confess affection for a rival house. Every sip lowered defences, and sharp-eyed guests took notes faster than a monastery scribe. The host knew this, of course. He carefully watched who was drinking what. Refills weren't accidental. If he wanted to loosen a tongue, send a third goblet. Want to dull a rival's senses before making a veiled threat? Another toast. Want someone to embarrass themselves? Let the minstrel write them a personalised drinking song. Some guests held their liquor like champions, calmly sipping while others slurred declarations of war. Others didn't fare as well. Slumped over trenchers, giggling into gravy, or challenging each other to wrestling matches near the spit-roasted pig. Alcohol stripped away titles and turned lords into fools. But even among the chaos, there was ritual. Drinking customs were taken seriously. You raised your cup with your right hand, never turned your back on the high table, and you never drank before the host. Breaking these rules didn't just risk scorn, it risked scandal. And yet, many didn't care. Once the drink flowed, ambitions blurred. Enemies toasted each other, allies muttered insults, and somewhere in the confusion, alliances shifted like chairs in a crowded hall. By the end of it, some guests were red-faced and roaring, others were whispering in corners, and a few were simply trying not to fall asleep in the soup. The feast was far from over, but already the line between celebration and scheming had completely vanished. In a medieval banquet, not all appetites were created equal. While the feast may have looked like a free-for-all of roasted animals and sugared fantasies, every mouthful was dictated by rank. Let's start with the obvious, the high table. Here, the nobility were practically drowning in delicacies. They got first pick of the meat, tender cuts, rare birds, pastries filled with almond and honey, and the elusive white pudding served only to those deemed worthy of multiple coats of arms. A servant carved their portions with surgical precision, and their goblets never saw the bottom. Just a few paces away, down the social food chain, were the lesser nobles and knights. Their dishes looked similar, but tasted less majestic. They got the leg instead of the breast, the fish instead of the venison, and sometimes, if the steward liked them, a spoonful of the sauce that had been sent up the table first. It was trickle-down feasting at its finest. Further back were the clergy, scribes, merchants, and any other semi-important figures the host didn't want to insult, but also didn't really want to talk to. Their trenchers might have a stew, maybe a boiled vegetable, and if they were lucky, something with spices, though diluted, of course. And then there were the servers, musicians, entertainers, and the poor fools who had to help turn the spit. They might be allowed to eat after the guests had left, or not at all. Leftovers were a treasure, and they'd be divided with the same strict hierarchy. The jester might get a slice of pie, the stable boy got the crust. But the most humiliating detail? It wasn't what you were given, it was how it arrived. If you were important, dishes were brought on silver platters, with a flourish and a bow. If not, it was more of a clunk on the table and a grunt. Sometimes you had to pass your plate forward and hope the food made it back. And if you were at the end of the hall, well, let's just say the boar might have been warm when it started its journey. Food was fuel, yes, but also a scoreboard, a living reminder of who mattered and who was just there to fill space. While the great hall echoed with laughter, music, and the occasional drunken hiccup, the real chaos roared behind the scenes, in the kitchens. Massive, smoky, and dangerously hot, this was the engine room of the banquet. And it ran on sweat, stress, and sheer panic. Forget the image of a single chef calmly tasting a sauce. Medieval kitchens were bustling ecosystems, sometimes staffed by dozens of workers. There were spit boys, usually young boys whose only job was to rotate heavy meat over a fire for hours. Their arms numb, their faces red, they prayed for mercy or a distraction, but got neither. Then came the sauce makers, the butchers, the pastry cooks, and the scullions, the unfortunate souls responsible for washing everything with sand, ash, and sheer determination. Instructions were shouted over the roar of the hearth. Boars had to be stuffed, pies sealed, birds flamed, and eels skinned, all in time to send wave after wave of perfectly timed dishes. Timing was everything. Too early, and the goose would be cold. Too late, and the Lord might think it an insult. But this wasn't just a workplace, it was a battleground for ambition. The master cook held power almost equal to the steward. A successful dish might elevate him to permanent employment. A spoiled sauce could get him dismissed, or worse, publicly humiliated. And heaven help the kitchen boy who confused saffron with mustard. That kind of mistake could get you flogged or assigned to clean out the garderobe for a week. The ingredients themselves were exotic and expensive. Sugar came from distant lands. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and pepper had to be measured like treasure. A misused pinch could cost more than a servant's weekly wage. Despite the pressure, the cooks often worked in brilliant synchronization. They communicated in gestures, sharp glances, and a hierarchy as strict as the one out in the hall. They knew who was trusted to touch the meat, who could season, and who should stay out of the way unless asked to fetch firewood. And when the dish was ready, it was paraded out like royalty. Every platter was a messenger, every pie a performance. The kitchen may have been hidden, but its success or failure would be the stuff of noble gossip for weeks. As the candles burned low and the air grew thick with spilled wine, roasted fat, and too much perfume, the banquet shifted. The feasting slowed, the music softened, and the noble masks, those tight smiles and careful words, began to slip. The final remove had come and gone, often a sweet course of moulded marzipan or spiced fruits served more for status than satisfaction. Servants cleared the wreckage, bones, crusts, broken trenchers, while discreetly listening for anything worth reporting. In the background, some guests still lingered, prodding cheese wheels or sipping dregs of wine they no longer tasted. This was when the real business often began. Tipsy merchants whispered deals over half-empty goblets. Ambassadors, flushed with mead, made statements they would regret by sunrise. Lovers slipped behind tapestries or out into moonlit gardens, pursued by scandal or opportunity. And somewhere in the corner, a minor noble, far too drunk, was being helped into a cloak he'd probably never remember removing. But for the host, the work was not yet done. He took mental notes of who stayed too long, who left too early, and who caused trouble. A spilled goblet might be forgiven. A drunken insult toward a favoured guest? Not so much. Every laugh, every gesture, every raised eyebrow was weighed. The banquet may have ended, but its effects would ripple through the court like a dropped jewel into a well. And not everyone got to leave right away. Some guests were offered chambers to sleep off the wine. Others were politely escorted to their carriages, especially if they had started singing. A few unfortunate souls ended the night slumped against a column, dreaming of roast pheasant and regretting that third cup of spiced wine. As dawn crept across the manor, the great hall stood silent, littered with half-melted candles, overturned cups, and the echoes of ambition, laughter, and regret. Servants began scrubbing the floors, cooks collapsed near dying embers, and the host retired to tally favours gained and debts incurred. Medieval banquets were never just meals. They were performances, negotiations, declarations of wealth and control. Every trencher, every toast, every tune was carefully orchestrated chaos. And in the end, once the last goblet was drained, all that remained was memory, and perhaps a nasty headache. If your mental image of the Middle Ages includes everyone being perpetually dirty, covered in lice, and terrified of soap, think again. Sure, there were plenty of muddy peasants trudging through life, but for many medieval townspeople, public bathhouses were a normal part of weekly life. And no, we're not talking about some primitive dunk in a pond. These were structured, purpose-built spaces for cleanliness, relaxation, and sometimes much more. Bathhouses in medieval Europe had deep roots in Roman tradition. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, many public baths crumbled into ruin, but the idea survived. By the High Middle Ages, cities across the continent, especially in places like France, Germany, and parts of Italy, saw a resurgence of communal bathing culture. In fact, it wasn't uncommon for bathhouses to be among the first stone buildings erected in newly chartered towns. Inside, the setup was often surprisingly sophisticated. Think tiled floors, large wooden tubs or small stone pools, a hot water room, a cooling room, and occasionally even a massage table. Water was heated in copper cauldrons and piped or carried into the bathing chambers. Some bathhouses had multiple tubs for different temperatures, echoing the Roman caldarium, tepidarium, and frigidarium. This wasn't medieval roughing it. This was Spa Day, 13th century edition. But bathing wasn't only about hygiene, it was social. People bathed in groups, friends, spouses, even strangers. You might chat with your neighbour, talk politics, or seal a trade deal while scrubbing your armpits. And for couples, it could be downright romantic. Some bathhouses offered private rooms for lovers to soak in peace. Others didn't bother with privacy at all. Bathhouses weren't just frequented by the wealthy either. Artisans, merchants, even well-off peasants would visit regularly, especially on Saturdays. It was a weekly reset, a way to show up to Sunday Mass looking and smelling like a respectable Christian. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Some religious authorities grumbled about the lascivious behaviour in mixed-gender baths, but many clergy used bathhouses themselves, often in separate, more discreet settings. In short, the bathhouse wasn't just a tub of water, it was a medieval crossroads, where soap, society and sin all met under the same steamy roof. Step inside a medieval bathhouse and you might be surprised. These weren't grimy back-alley huts with leaky roofs. Many were carefully constructed, sometimes lavishly so, designed not just for function, but for comfort, aesthetics, and social prestige. The exterior might resemble a modest house or, in wealthier cities, a small civic building, but once inside, the atmosphere changed completely. The bathhouse was a place of warmth and steam, flickering torchlight bouncing off damp plaster walls, tiled floors slick with condensation, and the smell of herbs, soap and heated water wafting through the air. The layout typically followed a Roman-inspired sequence. First, there was the undressing room, or apoditerium, where bathers left their clothes in the care of attendants, often while chatting with fellow guests. Then came the heated rooms. Water was boiled in giant copper cauldrons and piped or carried into large wooden or stone tubs. Some establishments had one enormous communal bath, while others offered individual tubs lined up in rows like booths in a medieval wet market of nudity. Temperature mattered. The water was warm but not scalding. Richer bathhouses even had multiple rooms with different heat levels, some mimicking the caldarium, hot room, tepidarium, warm, and frigidarium, cold plunge, of ancient Roman baths. The more refined the establishment, the more architectural complexity it boasted. Vaulted ceilings helped trap heat, chimneys vented steam, wooden benches lined the walls for those who preferred to sweat before soaking. Lighting was minimal but intentional, candles and oil lamps positioned to create soft shadows, adding to the bathhouse's cozy, almost dreamy atmosphere. In higher-end places, the walls were sometimes decorated with tapestries or murals, and fresh rushes or herbs were scattered on the floor to mask odours and add a touch of greenery. And then there were the little luxuries: bowls of rose water for rinsing, linen towels, combs and razors for grooming, and sometimes even attendants to scrub your back or massage your shoulders. If you could afford it, you were treated like nobility, even if you were just the town baker. These bathhouses weren't just buildings, they were designed experiences. Temples to cleanliness, yes, but also to status, comfort, and community. The architecture didn't just serve a purpose. It set the tone for everything that happened inside. Once you were undressed and immersed in the bathhouse proper, it wasn't just a matter of splashing around. Medieval bathing followed a surprisingly structured routine, a ritual of steam, soap, and scrubbing that mixed Roman tradition with medieval practicality. Most bathers began by warming themselves with a gentle soak in hot water. This wasn't just for relaxation, it helped open the pores and loosen dirt. Bathhouse attendants, known as rubbers or stridulators, were often on hand to assist, especially in fancier establishments. They'd bring soft linen cloths, herbal rinses, and, if you had the coin, scented oils. Next came the soap, and no, not the factory-pressed bars you're used to. Medieval soap was typically a chunky, brownish lump made from animal fat and lye. In some regions, especially Islamic-influenced areas like southern Spain, olive oil-based soaps were prized and imported for their gentle touch and pleasant scent. Soap was rubbed in vigorously, sometimes by the bather, sometimes by an attendant, until the body was slick and foamy. Then came scraping and exfoliation. Just like the Romans before them, medieval bathers often used a curved metal tool called a strigil. It was run along the skin to remove dead skin, dirt, and oil. It wasn't exactly spa-level comfort. It could be a little rough. but it left you feeling genuinely clean. Some bathhouses also used coarse cloths, or even natural abrasives like salt or crushed herbs for a deep scrub. Hair care was another step. Men might have their beards trimmed or their scalps massaged with vinegar and rosemary. Women sometimes had their long hair combed out with herbal rinses and carefully dried by the fire afterward. The most prestigious bathhouses offered grooming services as part of the package: shaving, nail cleaning, and even minor wound dressing. The final rinse often involved cool or lukewarm water, poured over the head from a basin or ladled from a tub. Then came the toweling off. Linen if you were lucky, scratchy wool if you weren't. All this effort wasn't just about hygiene, it was about presentation and pride. Cleanliness was associated with moral uprightness and social respectability. In a time when body odor could mark you as uncivilized, the bathhouse offered a way to restore not just your scent, but your status. To the medieval mind, the bathhouse wasn't just for hygiene, it was also a social arena. Once your skin was scrubbed and your hair was rinsed, you didn't simply towel off and head home. You lingered, you talked, you schemed. The bathhouse was where reputations were built, deals were struck, and tongues wagged more freely than in any castle courtyard. Let's start with business. Merchants frequently used bathhouses as neutral grounds to negotiate. The logic? No swords, no guards, just warm water and warm tempers. Once your rival was half submerged and relaxed, they were far more likely to say yes to that grain shipment or agree to a better price on wool. Bathhouses were perfect for disarming conversations, both figuratively and literally. Then there was gossip, and lots of it. Lords' affairs, land disputes, tax changes, and local scandals all floated to the surface here. Bathhouse workers themselves were information goldmines. They saw who came in together, who left red-faced, and who whispered too closely in the steam. Want to know who was secretly meeting with the bishop's cousin? Ask the guy changing the towels. And of course, where there's steam and skin, there's flirting. Mixed gender bathing was common in many parts of Europe, especially in Germanic and Central European regions, until the late Middle Ages. Men and women soaked in adjacent tubs, or even shared them. In some bathhouses, couples dined together while bathing. Wooden trays floated between them with wine, fruit, and sweetmeats. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Naturally, this led to concerns. Clergy often denounced bathhouses as dens of temptation. Pamphlets warned of lust boiling over in the hot water. And, well, they weren't always wrong. Some bathhouses had a reputation. There were stories, some true, some exaggerated, of discreet curtains, back rooms, and extra services available for those who asked. In some cities, the line between bathhouse and brothel became so blurred, officials had to step in and re-regulate who could work there and what was really being offered. Still, for most people, the bathhouse was simply a place to unwind, together. In a world without cafes, spas, or social media, this steamy, communal space served as the town square of the naked, a place to connect, share stories, and see who was really who, once the armour and robes came off. Strangely enough, the medieval bathhouse wasn't just about scrubbing and gossip. It also came with table service. In many towns, you didn't just bathe, you dined while bathing. That's right. In the warm mist of the communal tub, trays of roast meat, sweet pastries, and goblets of wine floated by like miniature ships of indulgence. This practice was especially common in Central and Northern Europe, places like the German-speaking regions of the Holy Roman Empire. Bathhouses there doubled as eating establishments, and not just any eateries. They offered multi-course meals that rivaled some feasting halls, all enjoyed while you were partially submerged in hot water with your friends, your spouse, or a potential romantic prospect. Meals were often served on floating trays, specially designed wooden platforms with raised edges to avoid disaster. One might carry roasted game hen, another a small pitcher of ale, while yet another bore soft bread and honeyed dates. If you wanted to impress a companion, you might even send over a tray, like a medieval version of buying someone a drink across the bar, only with more splashing. Servants, often barefoot to avoid slipping, wove between the tubs and benches, delivering platters, refilling goblets, and making sure the experience stayed luxurious, or at least orderly. The larger bathhouses had private rooms with their own tubs and tables, allowing for more intimate dining, often by candlelight. The combination of warmth, wine, and dim lighting did little to discourage the more flirtatious elements of bathhouse culture. But it wasn't all decadence. For those who couldn't afford wine and roast duck, bathhouses still offered food, simple stews, meat pies, or bread and cheese. Communal dining reinforced the social nature of the bathhouse. You were part of a group, and sharing a meal, especially half-naked, had a way of breaking down social stiffness. Naturally, the church raised an eyebrow at the whole arrangement. Dining in a state of undress, scandalous, sharing wine with the opposite sex in a tub, practically sinful. And yet, these steamy suppers continued for centuries, proving that no matter the era, people love a little luxury with their soap. The bathhouse was never just a bath. It was a sensation for all the senses: hot water, soft music, delicious food, and the constant possibility that your dinner date might end in either romance or rumour. For all their warmth and charm, medieval bathhouses carried one dark, steamy secret: they could be deadly. When plague came to town, especially the infamous Black Death, public bathhouses transformed overnight from social sanctuaries into potential death traps. At first, the connection wasn't obvious. People continued to visit bathhouses even as rumours of illness spread. In fact, many believed that bathing would protect them. After all, washing off grime and odours was a kind of moral and spiritual cleansing. Some even added herbs like sage, lavender, and rosemary to the bathwater in hopes of purifying both the body and the air. Physicians at the time suggested warm baths as a remedy for imbalanced humours. But there was a fatal flaw in this logic. Bathhouses were communal. People shared tubs, they shared towels, they ate from the same trays. And when infection spread by fleas, poor sanitation, or even close contact, these cosy, steamy rooms became breeding grounds for catastrophe. Worse, many bathhouses were located near water sources that also fed public wells or laundries. Contaminated runoff from the baths, full of dead skin, sweat, and sometimes blood, could easily taint a town's drinking water. As plagues and epidemics returned in waves during the 14th and 15th centuries, bathhouses came under serious scrutiny. Authorities began to shut them down, temporarily at first, then more permanently in some cities. Religious leaders had long suspected bathhouses of being morally suspect, and now they had a medical excuse. Better to be dirty and alive than clean and buried, some argued. And just like that, centuries of bathing culture began to unravel. People grew paranoid. Soap makers saw a drop in business. Public bathhouse owners closed shop, and those who remained open had to enforce new protocols. Separate tubs, limited guests, more herbs and perfumes to cleanse the air, though none of it truly worked. Some bathhouses even paid for priests to bless the water. Superstition mixed with desperation. The irony? As bathhouses disappeared from cities, general hygiene actually declined. Fear of contagion made people avoid washing entirely. And so, by the late Middle Ages, the idea of the filthy, unwashed peasant wasn't entirely wrong. It was just a product of fear, not laziness. From luxurious spa to suspected plague chamber, the bathhouse's fall from grace was as swift as it was tragic. Behind the steamy glamour of the medieval bathhouse was an invisible army, the workers who made it all run. They scrubbed the floors, hauled water, stoked the fires, and dealt with half-naked nobles barking orders while balancing wine goblets. And like everything in the Middle Ages, there was a strict hierarchy, even in the bathhouse. At the top stood the bathmaster, or Stüblein in parts of the German-speaking world. He managed the whole operation: maintenance, supplies, scheduling, and most importantly, the mood. He was part innkeeper, part spa manager, part gossip broker. If someone powerful was coming, he'd know it in advance. If someone scandalous had just left, he'd definitely know that too. Below him were the attendants, mostly men in mixed bathhouses, women in others, depending on local customs and laws. Their duties ranged from preparing the baths, helping guests undress, pouring rinsing water, and, in many places, even offering light massages or grooming services. A trusted attendant could make or break your experience. Then came the labourers, often young boys or poorer townsfolk. They were the ones carrying buckets of boiling water, chopping firewood, scrubbing used tubs, and dealing with the aftermath of wine-fueled evenings. These were the invisible hands who kept the entire system working, usually for little more than a warm meal and a place to sleep behind the boiler. In larger or more upscale bathhouses, you might also find cooks, musicians, and serving staff. Some bathhouses were so elaborate they employed entertainers, lute players, singers, even small theatrical troupes who performed while people soaked. These workers walked a delicate line between serving guests and maintaining propriety, especially in bathhouses with reputations for more than just bathing. And, in some cases, bathhouse workers doubled as spies. A keen bath attendant could listen in on whispered negotiations, watch who bathed with whom, and report back to powerful employers. Lords and clergy were known to plant informants in bathhouses, especially during tense political seasons. Despite their critical role, bathhouse staff lived on the margins. They were often mistrusted, especially during outbreaks, and accused of spreading disease or immorality. But without them, the warmth, the rituals, the elegance, all of it would have gone cold. The bathhouse may have been a place of equality in the tub, but outside it, the social ladder remained firmly in place. If there was one institution that always had a suspicious eye on bathhouses, it was the medieval church. To them, the bathhouse was a place where cleanliness walked a fine line with carnality, and steam often disguised sin. On paper, the church had no problem with hygiene. Many monasteries even had their own private bathing areas, and religious texts occasionally encouraged cleanliness as a virtue. Clean body, clean soul. But communal bathing, mixed gender tubs, wine and music, that, in the church's eyes, was an invitation to temptation wrapped in a towel. By the 13th century, as public bathhouses flourished across European cities, sermons began to target the moral dangers lurking within. Priests warned that bathhouses encouraged lust, immodesty, and secret liaisons. Some even went so far as to claim that Satan himself stirred the waters, luring good Christians into steamy moral collapse. And there were plenty of rumours to fuel the fire. Stories circulated of wealthy patrons reserving private rooms for more than just a bath. There were whispered tales of bathhouse staff offering special services for the right price, and couples arranging secret trysts behind misty curtains. Whether these stories were exaggerated or true, the church didn't wait to find out. In more conservative towns, church councils began imposing restrictions. Mixed bathing was banned in some regions, while in others, bathhouses had to close on Sundays or holy days. Some areas mandated gender-segregated hours, while others required bathhouse owners to register their staff and guests, turning bathhouses into proto-surveillance zones. But despite the suspicion, many clergy still used bathhouses themselves, just quietly. Bishops and abbots were known to book private rooms or use bathhouses run by monasteries, where discretion was easier to manage. The tension between public morality and private indulgence ran deep. Eventually, during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, many Protestant leaders cracked down even harder. They saw public bathhouses as corrupt relics of Catholic permissiveness and sought to cleanse society by closing them down, ironically reducing public hygiene in the process. The church may not have built the bathhouse, but it certainly tried to police it. In doing so, it turned the humble act of bathing into a spiritual balancing act, between purity of body and purity of soul, between hygiene and heresy, and between a splash of water and a slippery slope. At its height, the medieval bathhouse was a cornerstone of urban life, steamy, social, and surprisingly sophisticated. But by the end of the Middle Ages, these bustling centres of hygiene and humanity had all but disappeared. What happened? Several forces collided to bring about the decline of public bathing. The first and most obvious? Disease. The Black Death and recurring plagues had permanently damaged public trust in communal spaces. Though it's now understood that fleas and poor sanitation were to blame, many at the time believed bathhouses were literal breeding grounds for death. The steam, the shared tubs, the damp linens, it all seemed suspicious, and by the 15th century, fear trumped cleanliness. But there were other pressures too. As moral conservatism spread, especially during the Protestant Reformation, bathhouses were increasingly labelled as immoral dens of vice. Reformers viewed them not as places of hygiene, but as hotbeds of temptation and sin. In their eyes, nudity and spirituality didn't mix, even if there was a clean towel involved. At the same time, medical thinking began to shift. New theories about disease and the body emphasized dryness. Some physicians warned that hot water opened the pores and made people more vulnerable to infection. Cold, dry skin became the new ideal, and suddenly, a person who avoided bathing wasn't dirty, they were wise. Urban development also played a role. As cities expanded and water systems aged or crumbled, maintaining large public bathhouses became difficult. Fresh, heated water was expensive. Drainage systems clogged, regulations piled up, and without the profits of their glory days, many bathhouses simply closed their doors. By the 16th century, private hygiene practices had started to take precedence. Wealthy households installed private tubs, perfumed cloths and dry washing with linen became fashionable. Bathing shifted from a public ritual to a private, even secret act. And so, a centuries-old institution faded. The laughter, the music, the gossip, the floating food trays, it all vanished into mist. Today, only ruins, old manuscripts, and a few architectural relics remain to remind us of a time when getting clean meant more than just soap and water. It meant community. It meant conversation. It meant stepping into a steamy room and seeing your neighbours, literally, for who they really were. Before it was ever called the Silk Road, there were just trails, faint, dusty arteries through scorching deserts and snow-crusted mountains. But these paths, carved by herders, nomads, and early traders, would one day become the most legendary trade network in human history. Its true rise began during the Han Dynasty, around the 2nd century BCE, when China pushed westward, seeking alliances against the Xiongnu nomads. What they found instead was opportunity, a world of horses, glass, spices, and demand for silk. But this was no smooth highway. The eastern edge of the route began in Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, one of the largest and most cosmopolitan cities in the ancient world. From there, traders would load up camel caravans with rolls of shimmering silk, bundles of tea, lacquerware, and even porcelain. Then they'd set out, not toward one destination, but through a chain of relay points, markets, and oasis cities that stretched all the way to the Mediterranean. The road wasn't a single route, but a sprawling network that snaked through deserts, steppes, and kingdoms. From China, traders moved into the Taklamakan Desert, called the Place of No Return by some, then into Central Asia, crossing into Persia, and eventually reaching Byzantine territory. Goods passed from hand to hand, as did stories, languages, and even religious ideas. It was less of a road and more of a cultural bloodstream, but don't romanticize it too quickly. The journey was brutal. The blazing sun of the Gobi Desert cracked lips and burned skin. Sandstorms could bury entire caravans. Wells ran dry. Bandits stalked the dunes. And yet, traders pressed on, not just for profit, but for survival. If you were successful, you could return home wealthy. If not, well, you'd be buried beneath the sands, just another nameless soul claimed by the route. Still, it was worth it. Silk was worth its weight in gold. Roman nobles craved it. Persian kings demanded it. And so, from the very start, the Silk Road was never just about commerce. It was about connection. Empires linked by camel hooves and caravan bells. Cultures fused by jars of ink and bolts of cloth. A route born not just of geography, but of human ambition, and the irresistible need to reach what lies beyond the horizon. Imagine waking up before dawn, the air still cold despite the desert's daytime heat. You rise from your woven mat, brush sand from your face, and check your most important companions, not your fellow traders, but your camels. Grumbling, chewing, and stubborn, these creatures are the backbone of the Silk Road caravan. A typical caravan could include dozens or even hundreds of camels, each loaded with up to 500 pounds of goods. Bales of silk, bags of spices, rolls of wool, ivory tusks, and blocks of jade. But they didn't just carry cargo. They carried civilizations. Caravan life was relentless. Traders moved from oasis to oasis, timing their travels to avoid the worst of the desert sun. They followed ancient routes, mapped by stars and marked by bleached bones, evidence of those who had wandered off course. By day, they trudged across scorching dunes and rocky passes. By night, they gathered around flickering fires, preparing flatbread and broth, sharing news from distant cities, and guarding against bandits. Security was no small concern. Entire sections of the Silk Road were infamous for raiders, who knew the value of a single silk bundle. That's why many caravans hired mercenary guards, often Turkic or Sogdian fighters, skilled with bow and blade. When not fighting off attackers, they kept the peace within the caravan itself. Tensions were common when tempers flared and water ran low. Camels, meanwhile, were marvels of adaptation. They could go days without drinking, navigate shifting sands with ease, and endure the kind of monotony that would break a horse. They were sometimes dressed with bells, woven muzzle covers, and colourful cloth to show off a merchant's status or deter evil spirits. Along the way, caravans stopped at caravanserais, fortified roadside inns offering food, shelter, and a precious chance to rest. These way stations were melting pots where Arabic met Sanskrit, Chinese met Greek, and deals were struck in a dozen tongues. Caravanserais weren't just pit stops, they were crossroads of culture. Life on the Silk Road was exhausting, dangerous, and often soul-crushing. But for many, it was also exhilarating. To ride with a caravan was to stand at the centre of a grand exchange, a living artery of wealth, rumour, and risk that tied the world together, one hoofprint at a time. The desert might seem like an endless ocean of sand and heat, but to the seasoned Silk Road trader, salvation came in the form of oases, green, glittering jewels scattered across the dry vastness. These weren't just stops for water, they were lifelines, trading hubs, and sanctuaries wrapped in palm shade. Oases like Dunhuang, Kashgar, and Merv weren't just rest stops. They were bustling towns built around survival. Each one had its own character. Dunhuang, perched at the edge of the Gobi Desert, was a spiritual and artistic centre filled with Buddhist cave temples. Kashgar, further west, pulsed with life. Part marketplace, part fortress, part melting pot. Caravans could resupply here, trade cargo, switch camels, and gather intel on which routes were safe, and which were crawling with bandits or buried by sandstorms. And between these urban oases were the caravanserais, fortified inns spaced roughly a day's journey apart. Built with thick walls and high gates, they were designed to protect travellers and their cargo. The layout was practical. A central courtyard for unloading animals, sleeping quarters, storage rooms, a kitchen, and often a small prayer area. Sometimes there were resident cooks, healers, or even entertainers. Imagine arriving after days in the desert, your feet swollen, throat dry, eyes stung by wind, and finding a warm meal, a straw bed, and safe walls. To the weary merchant, it felt like paradise. But these stops weren't just about comfort, they were economic engines. Local traders came to the inns to barter or sell to passing caravans. News flowed freely. Currency rates, weather reports, rumours of war. new taxes, forbidden roads. An entire underground network of knowledge thrived in the dusty corners of these rest stops. Religious sites also clustered near oases, offering protection from more than just physical threats. A small shrine, a monk's hut, or a carved symbol in a wall could soothe the nerves of a superstitious traveller. Many stopped to offer a coin or prayer before continuing westward or eastward into the unknown. Without oases and caravanserais, the Silk Road would have been impassable. They were more than waypoints. They were civilization embedded in the wilderness, reminders that even in the harshest terrain, humanity finds ways to build connection, community, and commerce. When we think of the Silk Road, we think of silk. And yes, it was prized. Soft, shimmering, and impossibly light, silk was China's crown jewel. But the camel caravans didn't carry just fabric. They carried the aspirations of empires, bundled into sacks and crates. From east to west came porcelain, tea, lacquerware, paper, and spices like cinnamon and ginger. Chinese compasses and crossbows also trickled westward, changing the way people navigated and fought. But the road was not a one-way street. From the Mediterranean and the Middle East flowed glassware, silver, wool textiles, coral, wine, and dyed cloth. Even lowly soap became a popular item in the East, as did coloured inks and dyes. The cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, and others, acted as middlemen. Traders here often never travelled the entire route. Instead, they bought goods from one end and sold them at a markup to traders going the other way. The result? Goods changed hands dozens of times before reaching their final destinations. By the time a bolt of silk reached Rome, its price had multiplied tenfold, and no one quite remembered who first loaded it onto a camel. But these were more than luxuries. The demand for silk helped fund Chinese dynasties. The import of horses from Central Asia transformed Chinese warfare. Persian silver fueled Byzantine treasuries. And in time, even paper and gunpowder, two of the most revolutionary inventions, would cross the desert on the backs of weary animals. Alongside material goods came ideas. Buddhist sutras travelled from India to China. Islamic art and astronomy flowed eastward. Greek philosophy found its way into Arabic manuscripts. This wasn't just a trade route, it was a cultural superhighway, humming with invention and inspiration. Not all cargo was glamorous. Caravans carried raw minerals, herbs, grains, and dried fruit. Some even transported exotic animals, peacocks, parrots, lions, gifts for emperors or sideshow attractions for wealthy patrons. There was even a brisk trade in slaves, with people from all across Eurasia bought and sold like livestock. Everything had value. Everything had a price. And the caravans carried it all, wrapped in leather, tucked into crates, jingling with bronze seals, over mountains, through deserts, and across borders both real and imagined. The Silk Road may sound romantic, but for the travellers who crossed it, danger lurked around every dune and beyond every ridge. The desert didn't forgive mistakes, and neither did bandits. Banditry was a constant threat along the more isolated stretches. Armed raiders, sometimes nomads, sometimes rogue soldiers, watched the horizon for signs of slow-moving caravans. These weren't ragtag thieves. Some operated in organized gangs, with scouts, weapons, and even informants in oasis towns. They knew when a caravan was lightly guarded, or when it carried silk worth more than gold. Ambushes came swift and brutal. Camels scattered, goods looted, guards killed or captured. Survivors, if any, were left barefoot in the sand, too ashamed to return home. To combat this, wealthier merchants hired armed escorts, often mounted warriors from local tribes who knew the terrain, and the bandits. Others paid tolls or bribes to powerful nomadic groups in exchange for protection, which sometimes meant being robbed less. But even if you avoided human threats, nature had its own arsenal. The Taklamakan and Gobi deserts were notorious for their sandstorms, violent whirlwinds that could reduce visibility to nothing and bury travellers alive. Camels panicked, paths vanished. Men who strayed from the group could be swallowed by dunes in minutes. In mountainous passes, avalanches and rock slides replaced sand as the enemy. Loose footing and narrow trails meant one wrong step could send pack animals tumbling into canyons, taking half your profit with them. High altitudes brought freezing nights, frostbite, and altitude sickness, conditions many lowland traders were wholly unprepared for. Then there was the heat. Temperatures in the desert soared by day and plummeted at night. Travelers suffered cracked skin, infected wounds, dehydration, and hallucinations. Wells sometimes dried unexpectedly, and water thieves were hanged without ceremony. Disease was another silent killer. A single cough in one corner of a caravan could ripple into something far deadlier. Without any understanding of contagion, travelers mixed freely, and with them traveled fleas, bacteria, and viruses, unseen stowaways that would eventually bring empires to their knees. To survive a full journey was a badge of honor. Traders returned home thinner, wearier, and often far richer, but also changed. Every scar, every missing camel, every burial in the sand reminded them. The Silk Road didn't just demand money, it demanded blood, sweat, and the absolute will to keep moving. While silk and spices filled the saddlebags, it was ideas that truly transformed the Silk Road. The caravans didn't just carry goods, they carried beliefs, languages, and worldviews, and they spread like fire through the dust. One of the most significant cultural exports was Buddhism. Originating in India, it moved steadily eastward via traders and monks who traveled with the caravans. By the time it reached China, it had evolved, absorbing local beliefs and giving rise to new art, philosophy, and architecture. Monasteries sprang up along the route, places like Bamiyan in Afghanistan and Dunhuang in western China, offering rest, food, and spiritual refuge to travelers. These weren't just temples, they were repositories of culture, filled with scrolls, murals, and stories that bridged East and West. Islam followed a similar path in reverse, spreading from the Middle East into Central Asia and eventually into parts of Western China. As merchants set up shop in oasis cities, they brought with them the Quran, Arabic script, and a worldview built around trade, law, and scholarship. Cities like Samarkand became intellectual crossroads, where Persian poets, Arab scientists, and Indian mathematicians rubbed shoulders in candlelit libraries. Zoroastrian fire temples, Christian missionaries, Nestorian churches, and even Manichaean scrolls could be found tucked away in remote towns. The Silk Road didn't demand religious loyalty, it simply absorbed everything, allowing pilgrims, prophets, and philosophers to travel side by side with silk traders and camel herders. Language became a tool of survival and diplomacy. In the markets of Bukhara or Kashgar, a trader might hear Persian, Sogdian, Sanskrit, Chinese, Arabic, Greek, even a little Latin. Translators, called dragomans, were essential for navigating this multilingual world. Some carved entire careers out of simply knowing how to say silk, safe, and how much in 15 tongues. And with language came stories. Fables, myths, legends, and rumors moved across the continent. An epic poem born in Persia could become a fireside tale in Mongolia. A proverb spoken in China might find itself reworded in the hills of Anatolia. Ideas once unleashed were harder to track than camels, but far more enduring. In the end, the Silk Road wasn't just a trade route, it was a highway of the human spirit, a place where beliefs collided, evolved, and endured, riding side saddle on every caravan that dared to cross the sand. Among the many things traded along the Silk Road, silk, jade, spices, ideas, there was one commodity no one intended to carry: death. Disease travelled the same dusty roads, and when it arrived, it didn't barter, it consumed. The most infamous example, of course, is the Black Death. While its ultimate origin is still debated, many historians agree that it followed the very arteries of Silk Road trade, spreading west from the steppes of Central Asia to the ports of the Black Sea, and then devastating Europe. The plague moved faster than armies, carried not just by merchants and soldiers, but by the fleas riding on rats tucked away in grain sacks and cargo crates. Caravans, by nature, were ideal incubators for disease. Dozens of people and animals packed tightly together, sharing water, food, and sleeping quarters, all with minimal sanitation. Add in travelers from different climates with no shared immunity, and the result was a biological time bomb. A single infected person could bring chaos to an entire oasis town, turning bustling way stations into ghost settlements in a matter of weeks. But the Black Death was only the loudest whisper in a long conversation. Smallpox, measles, leprosy, and tuberculosis all passed along the Silk Road, often in both directions. Cities that welcomed caravans for centuries began to reconsider, installing health inspections, quarantine areas, and sometimes even closing their gates entirely. Some merchants tried to adapt. Caravans shortened their routes, stopped less frequently, or travelled at night to avoid detection. Infected goods were sometimes burned on arrival, regardless of their value, but fear was hard to contain. Stories of sudden fevers, black boils, and dead animals haunted campfires all along the route. Yet even amidst the fear, trade didn't stop. The lure of wealth and connection was simply too powerful. If anything, the plagues highlighted the double-edged nature of the Silk Road. It was the world's greatest circulatory system, and its most dangerous one. Empires rose because of the Silk Road, but in its shadow, entire populations fell, not by sword, but by breath. The same camel that carried perfume and porcelain could also carry pestilence, and the same road that brought cities to life could, with chilling speed, leave them eerily silent. Hidden beneath the dust of history are the women who walked, traded, ruled, and whispered through the caravan trails of the Silk Road. Though the chronicles often focused on emperors, merchants, and warriors, women were the quiet architects of this transcontinental exchange. In caravan towns like Samarkand, Merv, and Turfan, women played crucial roles in both the domestic and economic heartbeat of the region. Many managed inns, stalls, and tea houses, essential stops for traders and travellers. These establishments weren't just places to sleep or eat. They were information hubs where secrets were traded alongside spices. Noble women, too, had their influence. In powerful Silk Road kingdoms, like the Sogdian principalities or the Tang dynasty's western provinces, women often acted as diplomatic liaisons, marriage partners, and cultural bridges. A well-placed marriage between dynasties or tribal clans could seal trade deals, end feuds, or open new routes. Some princesses were gifted not only with jewels, but with entire caravans, carrying dowries across thousands of miles. There were women traders too, especially in nomadic cultures. Among the Mongols, Uyghurs, and Turkic tribes, women were often educated, mobile, and entrepreneurial. They rode horses, managed property, negotiated with foreign merchants, and made key decisions about their family's wealth. In a society constantly on the move, everyone had to pull their weight, and gender lines were more flexible than in the courts of sedentary empires. Women were also creators. They wove the textiles that became prized exports, intricate patterns in silk and wool that bore the marks of distant faiths and local traditions. Some even composed poetry and music, passed from oasis to oasis, blending languages and melodies into cultural hybrids that lingered long after the merchants moved on. But not all stories were golden. The Silk Road also carried enslaved women, taken in raids or bought in distant ports, trafficked as commodities alongside ivory and incense. Some ended up in royal harems, others in brothels near caravanserais. Their names weren't recorded, but their labour, their suffering, and their survival shaped the very fabric of Silk Road society. Though rarely named in history books, the women of the Silk Road were everywhere, trading, guiding, healing, bargaining, and enduring. They were the voices in the marketplace, the hands behind the embroidery, and the hearts that kept the caravans moving forward. All roads, no matter how grand, eventually fade. By the 16th century, the once pulsing arteries of the Silk Road began to grow silent, not with a bang, but with a slow, inevitable unravelling. Several forces converged. First came the rise of maritime trade. With European powers carving sea routes to India and China, the long, dangerous land route began to lose its appeal. Why risk sandstorms and bandits when a ship could carry more cargo faster, cheaper, and relatively safer? Silk and spices that once passed through 10 middlemen now travelled directly from port to port. Then came empires and borders. The Mongol Empire had once unified vast swathes of Eurasia, creating a golden age of Silk Road stability. But after its collapse, new powers rose: Ming China, the Timurids, the Ottomans, and many were less tolerant of free trade. Tariffs increased. Routes became more dangerous. Some cities were razed in wars. Others simply withered as caravans stopped coming. Religion too played a role. As the Islamic world grew more conservative and Catholic Europe more insular, cross-cultural exchange slowed. Suspicion replaced curiosity. The Silk Road, once a symbol of connection, became a corridor of caution. But the road never truly died. It transformed. Old caravanserais became market towns. Ancient trails became pilgrimage routes. Some evolved into trade roads within empires, still used by locals for wool, fruit, and pottery. Even today, echoes of the Silk Road survive in modern highways and railways stretching across Central Asia. Its legacy, however, is immeasurable. The Silk Road stitched together continents. It spread Buddhism to China, Islam to the steppes, and paper to the West. It introduced peaches to Persia, horses to China, and the concept of zero across cultures. The letters of the alphabet, the design of your rug,